Hello. Our next speakers will speak to the intersection between the issues of climate change and biodiversity, which is often missed in public conversations about each, but which are critically intertwined. Michael Mantell is the president of Resources Legacy Fund and the Fund for a Better Future. Mr. Mantell is author and co-author of several books and articles, is the recipient of several conservation awards, and serves on the boards of directors of the Monterey Bay Aquarium and on the governing council of the Wilderness Society. For 20 years, he has designed and participated in programs and projects that have broadened the leadership and constituency of natural resource protection in an equitable way, engaging historically underserved communities. Tiernan Sittenfeld is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for the League of Conservation Voters, where she directs LCV's policy and lobbying efforts and oversees the National Environmental Scorecard. Tiernan's previous roles, in conservation advocacy include work with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group, US PIRG, as preservation advocate, co-director of the Heritage Forest Campaign, and field director for Oregon State PIRG. Welcome, Michael and Tiernan.
Thank you, Beth. And I'm really pleased to be here and to share thoughts with Tiernan and all of you on these really important topics. I really do strongly believe in the intersectionality of climate, biodiversity, and racial justice. And I think these are playing out all over the world now in the Campaign for Nature, which we proudly host, and in the America for the Beautiful at the federal level, and in California and Hawaii, where we have formal partnerships with each of those states, as I'm going to talk a little about. And as part of that too, I want to focus on the role that philanthropy is playing in pushing government, in helping government succeed, in leveraging government funding. And also, I think we want to touch on, and I know it's already been talked about a little bit, the $5 billion commitment that was made last week at the UN Climate Summit to global biodiversity and 30 by 30 efforts, with a very strong emphasis on Indigenous-led efforts around the world, which also too is playing out very significantly. And Wade Crowfoot touched on this in California, but also in Hawaii's 30 by 30 commitment to marine managed areas. And I think partly what's going on is that because of the climate crisis, the extinction crisis, and frankly, the realities of what the pandemic has brought on all of us, these issues are going from, particularly the conservation biodiversity issues as they relate to climate and to racial justice, are going from a nice to have to a need to have sense in terms of the public attitudes. And again, these are, scientists have long concluded this. Public health the data on public health is even clearer about this being essential to the future mental and emotional health of people in the planet. And I'm proud to be a small part of the overall effort that philanthropy is playing in making this more prominent in terms of government policies and in terms of public awareness and public support. So in the California context, we have a formal partnership with the state of California in implementing the governor's executive order that explicitly ties biodiversity and natural land conservation to achieving climate goals, providing for Native American rights, and leadership on and for committing to equitable access. And the governor in California committed to having an implementation plan by February of 2022. And Wade noted the role of ESRI in the data collection part. And our role in this partnership from the philanthropic side is to provide funds for increased staffing at the Natural Resource Agency, for the robust public process that Wade talked about, the workshops, facilitation, the creation of an advisory committee, and for intertribal consultations. And philanthropy is spending about $3 million right now in this effort. And part of also what we're doing outside of the formal partnership with the government is working hard with a lot of colleagues and other leaders to broadening public interest in engagement in this and broadening public support. We commissioned a poll in July of 2021 in California to look at public attitudes about 30 by 30. And we found even then, and there's a wide-ranging poll across California and broken down by different kinds of voters, demographics, age groups, and regions, 75% of voters in California support 30 by 30. It's particularly high support among women over 45 at 80%. But even a harder demographic is men over 55. That was at 73%. White support is at 73%, Latino support is at 78%. And even in more conservative areas in California, such as the Central Valley, the polling is at 76%. Some of the top rated issues that the respondents to this poll identified were protecting water resources, preserving California's wilderness areas, protecting natural lands that are important for wildlife and migration, protecting and restoring coastal wetlands and river floodplains. Ranked the highest. The other part of this poll I think is particularly interesting is that what are the strongest arguments in favor of 30 by 30? One was a legacy argument that California's natural beauty makes it a special place to live and enjoy the outdoors. Another was a wildlife argument about the importance of wildlife and animal and plant species and California's unique role in preventing extinction and biodiversity. A third strong argument at 63% was climate, the relation of climate, and particularly to wildfires, droughts, and natural disasters, as Wade talked about. And finally, at 62%, these are the four highest, was equity, that Californians across the state in rural and urban areas deserve access to clean, open spaces. In terms of the opposition arguments, they're generally much lower, all at the 40% range. In terms of what had provoked the most responses. So one was concern about getting in the way of hunters and fishermen and others who enjoy the outdoors by locking up lands. Second concern was the arbitrary nature of what does 30% do and who's going to benefit from the 30% and how rational are those moves going to be made, decisions going to be made by politicians who don't understand what's really happening on the ground. And the last concern expressed was the economy. How is it going to damage or affect the economy by putting major restrictions on agriculture, fishing, and housing? But overall, the polling just reaffirmed incredibly strong support across California for that. I think in California too, as Wade noted, federal designations are going to be really important. And I know Tiernan's going to talk about what's happening at the federal level, and I can comment on that too. Ag lands are going to be important, coastal waters. What we're right now particularly trying to focus the administration on, as Wade noted, the governor committed $3.7 billion with the legislature to climate resilience, with 30 by 30 being the highest priority in that over the next 3 years. And that's just an enormous amount of money in addition to the federal money that's going to come in and how already has come in. And so we're working hard to identify early win projects that have tribal components, that have strict biodiversity components, that have working lands components, and have access components, that where the state can spend money and make a difference and build support, show momentum, and make this all seem more real as we get ready for implementation. And then briefly in Hawaii, Governor Ige committed in 2016 to a Sustainable Hawaii initiative that has two major components that relate to this. He committed 30% of watersheds be protected by 2030. And the one we're most involved in through a formal partnership with the state and the Hawaii Community Foundation is called Huluma'a, which Marine 30 by 30, which commits Hawaii to having 30% of marine managed areas by 2030. And Halamuha stands for, it means literally in Hawaiian going forward. And in this context, it's working with communities in a forward-looking way. And so we have a formal MOU with the Department of Lands and Natural Resources, with the Hawaii Community and the Hawaii Community Foundation, with a strong emphasis on science and social design involving Native communities and Hawaiian residents in the design of these marine managed areas around each island. There is a strong emphasis on Native Hawaiian and customs and practices as part of this. And in polling in Hawaii, 90% of Hawaii's residents view coral reefs as important to the Hawaiian culture. More than 60% of the residents perceive the threat to coral reefs as large or extreme. 60% of the residents think conditions will be markedly worse over the next 10 years. And a majority of Hawaiians want action. I will say there's $10 million of private philanthropy going into this effort, again, to help assist government and to make sure there's robust scientific and public participation. And Hawaii, I mean, so many states have suffered during this pandemic, Hawaii particularly, because so much of its economy is dependent on tourism, which just hasn't happened. But even in July, the governor signed a bill that came out of the legislature setting up a new ocean stewardship fee to help implement this commitment on 30 by 30 that will take effect in 2024, which puts any person involved in recreational access to the ocean and going on, commercial trips on the ocean, whether it's just sightseeing or snorkeling or whatever, is going to pay $1 per head, starting at $1 per head for that, which was a tremendous political statement by the legislature and the governor at this time in terms of Hawaii's declining tourism. So all this I think all this will feed into thinking at the federal and global efforts, and these states are playing leadership roles, not only in their own jurisdictions, but in helping others determine how to go about it for their own places and at the federal level and globally. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, Beth, and we can return to discussion.
Great. Over to you, Tiernan.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Beth. And thank you to the Salazar Center for incredible leadership and for the chance to be here today. As Beth said, I'm Tiernan Sittenfeld. I'm currently at the League of Conservation Voters. I've actually been here for 16 years, but I did get my start in the environmental world as an organizer out west. And I moved to DC in 2000 to work on the roadless area conservation rules. So biodiversity issues are near and dear to my heart. And of course, they are a major priority for LCV and for our state LCV partners. I know that we're talking a lot about the intersection of climate and biodiversity, and we believe that is extremely important as a lens really through which we approach our work. So I'm going to focus most of what I'm going to say, and I'll try to be brief, on the Build Back Better Act, which is consuming Congress and the administration right now. And failure is not an option, as Senate Majority Leader Schumer has said. So we have got to get this done for so many reasons. We are working incredibly hard to make that happen because we really believe that this bill is our chance at once in a generation progress on climate, jobs, and justice. But it especially has to meet the moment on climate. It has to meet the climate test that we and many of our partners have put forward of cutting climate pollution in half by 2030. These emissions reductions that we have to achieve are going to come largely through really strong 10-year robust clean energy tax credits, through a clean electricity performance plan, we hope, through a methane fee, through other policy priorities. And there's sort of a whole pie chart that the Center for American Progress took the lead on pointing out. And so maybe John Podesta talked about that earlier. These are so important for so many reasons, including that they're going to lessen the harm that the climate crisis will do to wildlife and our lands and waters. The Build Back Better Act, and I'm going to focus more on sort of the benefits for biodiversity, but it really is right at the intersection of climate and conservation. It would invest billions in nature-based climate solutions that'll help turn our public lands and waters into assets in the climate fight, even more than they already are. So the House Natural Resources Committee, and huge kudos to Chairman Grahova and his committee members, that portion of the bill includes billions for things like coastal restoration, forest restoration, climate smart agriculture. There are also protections for specific lands and waters that I know are so important to all of us to protect them from drilling and mining, including the Arctic Refuge, the area around the Grand Canyon and Oak Flat, Colorado's Thompson's Divide, and Eastern Gulf, Atlantic, and Pacific. Of course, there are really important reforms on oil and gas and how it's managed on our public lands and waters, like raising royalty rates and rental rates that are going to make companies pay their long overdue fair share and ideally prevent some drilling projects from moving forward. It is critically important that the Build Back Better Act advance equity in the outdoors, and the bill's investment in things like urban parks and a reimagined civilian climate corps are so important and have equity at their center. I will say, if any of you have connections to Senators Manchin or Sinema or any of the more conservative Democrats in the House, this is going to need to pass with 50 Democrats and at least 218 Democrats in the House, 50 in the Senate. So if you're not already reaching out to your members of Congress, that would be great to let them know what a priority this is. We have to move forward on the Build Back Better Act, and we have to do it now. In addition to Build Back Better, we are really focused on Congress building on the success of the Great American Outdoors Act and passing place-based conservation bills. Kudos again to Chairman Grijalva and to Colorado's Congresswoman DeGette, who are working so hard to move forward the Protecting America's Wilderness and Public Lands Act. We would love to get these done as quickly as we can as well. I'm going to talk for a minute about sort of the executive action side of things at the federal level, but I want to stress whether it's conservation or climate or both, whether it's executive action or legislation, we really have to approach our work. And I think this is starting, but there's still a long ways to go, in a different and a better way, and one that listens to and includes more voices from the get-go, that honors tribal sovereignty, that addresses inequities in access to nature, that prioritizes the communities that have been hit first and worst by a legacy of toxic pollution and by the climate crisis. So whether it's the Justice 40 initiative, or listening to tribes and restoring protections for bears' ears, or passing the Build Back Better Act that meets the moment in a way that science and especially justice, environmental and racial justice require, we have to seize all of these opportunities, and we need to make sure that nature's many benefits are shared equitably with all communities. So just a word before I turn it back to you, Beth. I know there's already been a lot of talk about protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. I just want to stress that LCV and our state partners are all in and very focused on that. A couple of highlights for us in recent months have been to help organize letters of support earlier this year in support of 30 by 30, one from 70 mayors and one from 450 state and local elected officials. And we also worked with our state partners on a report that highlights the recent state and local conservation progress is obviously so important to reaching the goal of 30 by 30. I'll wrap up just by way of saying it was really great to see the Biden administration right off the bat commit to such bold conservation goals, and to this one in particular. And of course, we appreciate the stakeholder-driven process that it's undertaking and working to reach it through the America the Beautiful initiative. But I also have to say we're now 8 or 9 months into office, and we really hope this administration is going to get going on using its executive authority to take meaningful action to reach 30 by 30, especially when it comes to restoring protections for national monuments like Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante and the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts. And we are eager for the administration to work with tribes and local communities who would like new places protected as well. So lots of great work underway, but clearly so much more to be done, and the stakes have never been higher.
Great. Thanks so much. I know that you work together, Tiernan and Michael, and I think our hope was that we might benefit from some dialogue between you before we go to the audience Q&A. We have a few minutes for that. If you'd like to ask each other questions or elaborate on either of each other's points. You both addressed, or you each addressed, Michael, sort of what progress at the state level and the role of philanthropy, and Tiernan, you were really talking about the federal role and public funding. So I'm curious how and where this comes together. So feel free to talk to.
I would love to ask you, Michael, I know you touched on it, or you touched on it, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about the really exciting news and the $5 billion philanthropic commitment, and what that means to you and what we can anticipate going forward from that.
Sure. Well, first of all, we're proud to work with LCV on a number of these issues and support Tiernan and her colleagues' efforts, both on the climate side and the conservation side. And they do remarkable work federally, but also with all their state chapters. And we can talk more about that. The $5 billion commitment is astounding. I mean, it's real money for, obviously. but it's coming from more the climate, traditional climate sector, and making a statement about how these issues are really intertwined. I think in a really way, because I've been pushing on the more traditional climate interests to understand how these issues are related, and these neat sort of categories of this is a land issue, or this is a biodiversity issue, and this is a climate issue, really are not that relevant anymore. And in fact, the public is, and even in California, a state that's really strong on climate, the polling is much stronger, frankly, on wildfire, on concerns about water or concerns about sea level rise than they are strict climate issues. And you have to go where the public is. So, and I think, what's unclear is, in that announcement, is how the money's going to, what's the decision-making process, how it's going to be operationalized, where are the priorities going to be. And I know those are all to be worked out. And I was so pleased to see so much focus put on Indigenous-led conservation as part of that statement. I think another unknown to me in this is whether any of that money is going to end up in the United States, helping the United States get to its 30 by 30 and helping Indigenous-led conservation in the United States succeed. Because so much of that focus is understandably global, but I would hope that we could see some of that money and the strong passion and commitments behind it about Indigenous-led conservation and equity make its way into the United States as well.
You want to add anything, Tiernan? Yeah.
Well, I think, Michael, it's an honor to work with you, and thank you so much for your longstanding leadership. We're all lucky to have you. I think, your points about sort of the intersectionality of the issues and what we've been talking about has never been more true. And especially you mentioned like the deadly fires, I was lucky enough to participate in a press conference in the Capitol yesterday with Speaker Pelosi and a number of members of Congress whose constituents are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And of course, there was the Washington Post piece that nearly 1 in 3 people in this country just this summer alone have suffered from or experienced climate-fueled extreme weather. And so we had Haley Stevens from Michigan talking about the once every 500 or once every 1,000 year floods and storms that are now happening week after week. We have members from the West who are talking about the heat that is affecting them in such a devastating way. And when we think about the fact that it's fossil fuels from our public lands and waters that represent like almost a quarter of our carbon pollution, like that is pretty clear that there is the problems are so massive, but the solutions are also so intertwined. And so that's why some of these big executive actions and this Build Back Better opportunity, knock on wood, these next couple of days are really pivotal to getting it all done. But it feels like there is this chance for such transformational change.
Interesting. I'm really struck by the intersectional nature of recent conversations, both about funding and about policy. And the Salazar Center spends a lot of time trying to make those connections and trying to reinforce, sort of the overlapping relevance of a lot of these issues. Given the continued political charge, for lack of a better term, of climate issues, does it make it harder to conserve biodiversity too, and the two issues are intertwined? Or have we really gotten to a place where it's gone from nice to have to need to have? I think there's still a little bit of I think there's an increasing understanding of the need to have, but of the connection between those things that might actually help make it less partisan. It just makes my head spin a little bit. So I'm curious if you can speak to that.
Well, let me just start off, Tiernan. It's been really, depressing to me, frankly. I grew up at a time professionally in Washington when there really was bipartisan leadership on these issues, and that isn't true anymore. And everyone's working hard to change that, but we have to understand that. But I will say a bright spot for me has been we've been working with Congressman Mike Simpson in Idaho on his proposal for the removal of 4 dams on the Snake River and the protection of salmon in Idaho's really ecologically pristine watersheds. and he's taken a very holistic approach, as some of you may know, that connects up the salmon in Idaho with the the whole transmission system in the Pacific Northwest, with the orcas in Puget Sound and out in the oceans, and with the need for agriculture and industry in Idaho and Eastern Washington to succeed without the barging that takes place with those dams. And it's just remarkable, his commitment, his passion, his deep understanding, and the support of Nez Perce and other tribes and other interests in that proposal. So that gives me a little hope, Beth, about where these things could go over time. But it's really hard, and Tiernan's in the middle of it every day in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and I think this is such a good question, and there's not necessarily an obvious answer, because I think one of the highlights of the last few years, certainly of the Trump administration, which is of course a very low bar, but the fact that the Great American Outdoors Act passed with so much bipartisan support and was signed into law by the former president, and that is such a massive conservation win, is really exciting. At the same time, I think when I first got to Congress and started working on environmental issues, and people may have seen Sherry Boehlert, who was the longtime chair of the House Science Committee, a Republican from New York in Congress for I think 24 years, who actually passed away last week, but was such a champion and a hero, and we're so grateful for him. But he regularly would have dozens of House Republicans who would vote pro-environment with him, and that was great. And then things have become more partisan, especially when it comes to climate issues. I think it's in part because of some of the contributions that we see that mostly go to one side of the aisle. But I do think that there is an opportunity, especially for young people, across ideologies, across party lines. People want to make progress. They want to get things done. Unfortunately, the reconciliation opportunity that we have means it's probably going to be partisan, which is too bad. At the same time, this is our shot at making this great progress. So we have to move forward right now. Again, we need every Democrat going big on climate, going big on the conservation provisions. But I think combining these issues in smaller ways, and certainly at the state and local level, I think there's so much opportunity.
So here's another, and I'm moving into audience questions now. Another angle on that same question is that the management of the response to these challenges has historically been siloed in government agencies at the local, state, and federal level. Can you point to examples of successful integration? Does that happen primarily through funding? What's the perspective there?
Michael, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I do. I think that's a really, really important issue. I think the siloing gets in the way. And that's why I think these more holistic, interconnected approaches are the way to the future. I do think tribal leadership, indigenous-led conservation, I think that the bringing social equity groups, racial justice groups, underserved communities more to the forefront of these issues breaks down some of those silos. And we have seen changes as a result in government responses at all levels of government, I think. Maybe not fast enough, not enough. The tremendous amount of funding that was as Tiernan said, in the Great America's Outdoor Act has priority for some of these issues and some of these funding. And I think the money that could come out of the reconciliation package, and that is right now California's in this incredible surplus, really helps to break down a lot of those silos.
Definitely. And I think there are, maybe the Chesapeake Bay program is an interesting example. One of my colleagues who now works at LCV in DC, but came to us from Maryland LCV, and he has been involved in that effort to bring together local and both the local agencies, state and federal agencies, to really save one of the biggest estuaries in the world. We hope by 2025. There's clearly tons of work to be done, but progress underway. And I think the more examples like that around the country, the better off we'll all be.
That's great. Okay, one last question from the audience, and then I think we'll perhaps move to the next point in the program. How can we work to ensure that the commitment to new wind and solar projects and related transmission doesn't impact land conservation and biodiversity efforts. And I think many of us who've worked in both of these issues over time have seen where those can run up against each other. When you have the integration of these issues, it seems important to figure out how those decisions will be made. Curious if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, I've been directly involved in that as it related to the ARA package that was passed by Congress in 2009 with all these incentives for particularly utility scale solar, but also wind. And the press loved to write these articles then about green versus green, land conservation and wildlife interests versus the renewable energy interests. And it's now playing out in some proposals for ocean wind energy development. And I think, you know, it's important to do all we can to further renewable energy, but it's got to be done in the right way. And there are processes and mechanisms and inclusive ways of getting people at the table to agree on zonal approaches and understanding the science. And frankly, some of that played out in the Obama administration in the programmatic environmental impact statement that was done for citing utility scale solar throughout the Southwest in a zone approach, and that you're going to get incentives if you go into the right zones in terms of expedited permitting in the right zones for renewable energy development. And if you want to try to go outside those zones, the permitting gets much harder. So I think we need to continue to work on bringing people together from these various sectors to reach solutions that accommodate both.
Great.
No, I mean, very little to add. I think Michael captured it really well, but it's clearly we need really smart early planning. We need strong local consultation. And obviously we're really excited about increasing renewable energy, but as Michael said, needs to be done smart, needs to be done right.
Great. Thank you both so much. So honored to have you both here, and really valuable perspectives. Michael, did you want to say one more thing?
Just thank you, Beth, and the Salazar Center for putting this all together. It was really great, really important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, really glad to have you.